The telegram was burning a hole in Jimmy Stewart's pocket when the studio executive walked into his dressing room without knocking. 3 words on yellow Western Union paper that would destroy everything he'd worked 20 years to build. Promise kept today. Jimmy was supposed to be on set in 10 minutes. $2 million hung in the balance. The most powerful men in Hollywood were waiting for him to sign the biggest contract of his career. But those 3 words had just sentenced him to professional death. The executive's name was Harrison Marks, and he owned half of California. His smile was sharp as a blade. "Jimmy, my boy, ready to become the richest actor in America?" Jimmy looked at the man who held his future in his hands and realized he was about to commit career suicide for a promise made to a girl named Margaret Henley in 1928. A promise that would leave him blacklisted, broken, and forgotten. "Actually, Mr. Marks, there's been a change of plans." Harrison's smile disappeared like smoke. "What kind of change?" Jimmy Stewart reached into his pocket and pulled out the telegram. He read it one more time, knowing these 3 words would end everything. The mansion, the fame, the money, the respect. All of it would be gone in the next 5 minutes. "The kind that kills careers," Jimmy said quietly. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Jimmy Stewart was walking away from. This wasn't just another movie contract. This was a 3-picture deal with MGM that would pay him more money than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. $2 million in 1959 money. Enough to buy a mansion in Beverly Hills, a yacht, anything his heart desired. But more than the money, it was about power. This contract would make Jimmy one of the untouchables in Hollywood. The kind of star who could choose his own scripts, his own directors, his own destiny. He'd worked 20 years to get to this moment, starting as a nobody from a small Pennsylvania town. Harrison Marks wasn't just any executive. He was the man who could erase actors from existence with a single phone call. The man who decided which careers lived and which ones died. And Jimmy Stewart was about to commit professional suicide. "Jimmy," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "I don't think you understand what you're saying. You walk out on this contract. You never work again. Not just MGM. Nowhere. Not television. Not theater. Not even radio. I'll make sure every door in this town slams shut in your face. You'll be picking oranges in Bakersfield while other actors get rich off the roles I would have given you." Jimmy had known this moment would come. The moment when he'd have to choose between saving his career and keeping a promise to a dying girl. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Marks. I'm choosing death." "But wait, you haven't heard the worst part yet." Harrison's face turned the color of old leather. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Stewart. In 6 months, you'll be begging me to take you back." But Jimmy was already changing out of his costume. The 3-piece suit that cost more than his father made in a year. The shoes that were handmade in Italy. All of it felt like a prison uniform now. "Maybe so," Jimmy said, "but some mistakes are worth making." What Harrison Marks didn't know was that the telegram in Jimmy's pocket had been 31 years in the making. It had started on a summer night in 1928, when Jimmy was just Jim Stewart, helping his father run the hardware store in Indiana, Pennsylvania. Margaret Henley had been the prettiest girl in town. Jimmy had been in love with her since he was 14, but he'd never had the courage to tell her. Until that night by Miller's Pond, when she made him promise something that would destroy his life. "Promise me that if something terrible ever happens, if one of us is in real trouble, we'll drop everything and come running. No matter what." He promised. Young lovers always promise. They never think about what it will cost them. By 1959, Margaret was dying of cancer in that same Pennsylvania town. And Jimmy Stewart was about to learn that some promises are worth more than empires. He walked out of that dressing room knowing he'd just signed his own death warrant. But this is where the story gets truly devastating. Now here's where most people would have found an excuse. 20 years in Hollywood. $2 million on the table, and the most powerful man in the movie business threatening to destroy him? Most people would have sent flowers, maybe a card with a note saying he was sorry, but he couldn't get away. Most people would have chosen the smart thing. But Jimmy Stewart had never been most people. He walked out of that dressing room and straight to the studio parking lot, leaving behind Harrison Marx, the contract, and everything he'd spent his adult life building. But the nightmare was just beginning. Within hours, the entire Hollywood machinery turned against him. By the time Jimmy reached his car, 3 studio security guards were following him. By the time he reached the front gate, Harrison Marx was on the phone with every newspaper in Los Angeles. By the time he made it to Union Station, the story was already hitting the wire services across the country. The headline screamed betrayal. Jimmy Stewart walks out on biggest deal in Hollywood history. Radio announcers called him ungrateful. Industry insiders whispered about mental breakdowns and career suicide. But what nobody knew was why. The reporters who mobbed him at the train station couldn't understand it. How does a man walk away from $2 million? What could possibly be worth throwing away the chance of a lifetime? What kind of madman destroys everything for a telegram? Jimmy bought a ticket on the Pennsylvania Railroad, the same line he'd taken to college 31 years earlier. He didn't buy first class. He didn't ask for special treatment. He just wanted to disappear into a crowd of ordinary people making ordinary journeys to ordinary places. But you can't hide when you're one of the most famous faces in America. The train had barely left Los Angeles when reporters found him like vultures circling prey. They peppered him with questions, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his face like weapons. "Mr. Stewart, can you tell us why you walked out on the MGM deal?" Jimmy looked out the window at the California desert rushing past. Sometimes a man's got to do what's right, even when it costs him everything. But $2 million, Mr. Stewart, that's more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. You're throwing away your entire future for what? A telegram? Money doesn't keep promises. Jimmy said quietly. People do. The reporters pressed him for more details. But Jimmy just closed his eyes. What could he say? That he was risking his entire career for a girl he hadn't seen in 20 years? That he was throwing away financial security for a promise made by a 17-year-old boy who no longer existed? But as the train rolled through Arizona and into New Mexico, something strange happened. For the first time in months, Jimmy felt like he could breathe freely. The weight that had been sitting on his chest since he'd become famous started to lift. Here's what you need to understand about Jimmy Stewart in 1959. He wasn't just walking away from money. He was walking away from a life that was slowly killing him. Every role felt the same. Every interview, every premiere, every carefully staged public appearance felt like he was playing a character instead of living his life. Success in Hollywood wasn't just about making movies. It was about becoming a product, a brand, a carefully manufactured version of yourself that people would pay to see. Jimmy Stewart, the movie star, was charming, witty, all-American perfect. But Jim Stewart, the person, was suffocating under all that artificial perfection. The second day on the train, Jimmy struck up a conversation with an elderly farmer. The man's face was weathered from years in the sun, his hands rough from honest work. "What line of work you in, son?" the farmer asked, not recognizing the famous face. Jimmy almost said actor, but something stopped him. "I work for other people," he said instead. "But I'm thinking about changing that." The farmer nodded knowingly. "Had a job like that once myself. Good money, but it was eating me alive from the inside. Finally quit when my wife got sick. Realized all that money didn't mean a damn thing if I wasn't there when she needed me. Sometimes you got to choose between what pays the bills and what pays the soul." Those words hit Jimmy like lightning. What pays the soul? But wait, the story takes its darkest turn here. On the third day, as the train pulled into Chicago, Jimmy saw something that made his blood run cold. A stack of newspapers on platform, all with the same headline. Jimmy Stewart, Hollywood's biggest ingrate. The story painted Jimmy as an ungrateful prima donna who'd thrown a tantrum and walked out on the deal of a lifetime. It quoted unnamed sources saying Jimmy had become impossible to work with, that he'd lost touch with reality. But the worst part was the ending. Industry insiders say Stewart will never work in Hollywood again. His career is finished. Jimmy bought a paper and read the whole story standing on that Chicago platform. They destroyed him. Not just his reputation, but his future. Harrison Marx had kept his promise. By the time Jimmy reached Pennsylvania, every studio in Hollywood would know he was poison. Then the telegram arrived. Jimmy's hand shook as he read it. Legal proceedings begin Monday. Stop breach of contract. Stop studio. Seeking damages. Stop return immediately or face bankruptcy. Stop. Last warning. For the first time since he'd made his decision, Jimmy felt terror. They weren't just ending his career. They were going to take everything he owned. His house. His savings. Everything. But this is where Jimmy Stewart proved what kind of man he really was. He crumpled the telegram and threw it in a trash can. Let them take it all, he said to himself. A man's word is worth more than money. The train pulled away from Chicago, and Jimmy stared out at the flat Illinois farmland. He'd lost everything, but somehow he'd never felt more free. The train rolled through Indiana and into Ohio, getting closer to home with every mile. Jimmy thought about his father, still running the hardware store at 73 years old. A man who'd kept his word to every customer, every friend, every person who'd ever counted on him. The money will come and go, his father had always said, but your word is all you really own in this world. But you won't believe what happened when he finally reached Pennsylvania. The train pulled into Pittsburgh on a gray October morning. He caught a bus to Indiana, Pennsylvania, the small town where he'd grown up. As the bus rolled through familiar countryside, Jimmy felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt like he was coming home. The hardware store looked exactly the same. Stewart Hardware, painted green letters on a white wooden sign. His father was behind the counter, helping a customer choose the right size screws for a kitchen cabinet. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes still held the same honest light they'd always had. Dad. Alexander Stewart looked up, and for a moment, his face showed pure shock. Then it broke into the biggest smile Jimmy had seen in years. Well, I'll be damned if it isn't my boy. They embraced right there in the middle of the store, and Jimmy felt 20 years of Hollywood phoniness melt away like snow in the sun. This was real. This was home. This was who he used to be before the world convinced him to become someone else. What brings you back, Jimmy? Thought you were making some big picture out in California. I was, Dad, but I had to come home. I gave my word to someone a long time ago, and it's time to keep it. His father nodded as if this made perfect sense. Margaret Henley? Jimmy's eyes widened. How did you know? Son, I've been watching you for 41 years. I knew that girl still had a piece of your heart. When I heard she was sick, I wondered if you'd remember your promises. Margaret's house was a small white cottage on Elm Street. Jimmy stood on her front porch for a long moment before he knocked, his heart pounding like a teenager's. She opened the door herself. Cancer had taken weight from her frame and color from her cheeks, but her eyes were still the same blue as a summer sky. Jimmy, she said softly, you came. I promised I would. She smiled, and 31 years disappeared like smoke. I knew you'd remember. They sat on her front porch that afternoon, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret told him about her life, the children she'd raised, the school where she taught. I used to go to your movies, she said with a gentle laugh. Sitting in that dark theater, I'd think about that boy I used to know. But you seemed so far away, like you become someone else entirely. I had become someone else, Jimmy admitted. I forgot who I was supposed to be. And now I remember. But here's the part that will destroy everything you think you know about success. Jimmy Stewart didn't just visit Margaret for a few days and then return to his Hollywood life. He stayed. For 3 months, from October to December of 1959, Jimmy Stewart vanished from the world while his empire crumbled. He moved back into his childhood bedroom in his parents' house. He helped his father run the hardware store, waiting on customers who couldn't quite believe that the famous Jimmy Stewart was selling them nails and paint. Every day brought news of another door slamming shut in Hollywood. The Hollywood machine didn't just try to bring him back. They tried to destroy him completely. Harrison Marx sent private investigators to dig up dirt. Lawyers filed lawsuits for millions. His agent dropped him. His publicist leaked stories about mental breakdowns. But Jimmy turned them all down. He'd made his choice, and the price was everything he'd ever built. During those months, something remarkable happened that nobody expected. The knot of anxiety that had lived in Jimmy's chest for years began to unravel. He started sleeping through the night again. For the first time since he'd become famous, Jimmy Stewart felt like himself. But the price of that peace was absolutely everything he'd worked for. The newspapers called him crazy. Hollywood insiders said his career was finished. Fan magazines ran articles asking what happened to Jimmy Stewart. His bank account dwindled. His lawyer called with news of mounting legal fees. His house in Beverly Hills sat empty, gathering dust. Margaret died on a cold December morning, peacefully, with Jimmy holding her hand as snow fell outside the window. Her last words were, "Thank you for keeping your promise, my dearest friend." At her funeral, Jimmy gave a eulogy that no reporter recorded, no camera captured for posterity. He spoke about loyalty and love and the importance of keeping your word, even when the whole world thinks you're a fool. After the service, as the mourners filed away and the snow began to fall, Jimmy's father found him standing alone by the grave. "You going back now?" his father asked. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, watching the snowflakes settle on Margaret's flowers. "I don't know if there's anything to go back to, Dad. There's always something to go back to, son. The question is whether it's worth going back to." That night, Jimmy sat in his childhood bedroom, staring out the window at the snow-covered street where he'd played as a boy. All of it felt like someone else's dream now. But then something happened that nobody could have expected. On New Year's Day 1960, the phone rang in the Stewart house. The voice on the other end belonged to Frank Capra, the director who made Jimmy famous in It's a Wonderful Life. "Jimmy, I've been reading about what you did. You're not crazy. You're not finished. You're exactly the kind of man this business needs more of." Frank had an offer. Not a big studio picture with millions of dollars. Something smaller, more personal. A story about a man who finds his way home. "I can't promise you it'll make you rich," Frank said, "but I can promise you it'll make you proud." Jimmy looked out his bedroom window at the house across the street, where Margaret had lived her whole life, raised her children, and kept her promises until the very end. "When do we start filming?" That movie became The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and began the greatest phase of Jimmy Stewart's career. But it was different now. Every role he chose meant something. Every character he played taught him something about himself. He never took another role just for money. He never forgot the lesson he learned in those 3 months in Pennsylvania. He never forgot that keeping your word is worth more than keeping your fortune. He never forgot that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from everything the world tells you should want. Years later, when reporters asked him about his decision to leave Hollywood in 1959, Jimmy would always give the same answer. "I made a promise to someone who mattered. Everything else was just noise." Remember this. Jimmy Stewart gave up $2 million to sit by a dying friend's bedside. He chose his word over his wealth. He chose honor over money. He proved that a man's promise is worth more than all the gold in Hollywood. Your word is all you truly own in this world. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel if Jimmy's story reminded you what really matters. Thank you